Hi, I'm Meher Behel from Restore Conservation Services, and we have Professor Miles with us here today. He has very kindly donated his collection of building materials to the ABP faculty here, and we're here to discuss about that and to get a glimpse in his career as well. So, Professor Miles, this collection that you've donated to the university is a one-of-a-kind collection that's got materials from over the years and all the different kinds of materials that we can possibly have in a building material collection. Could you please give us an insight into what the collection has and when did you start collecting it?
I'm a retired professor of architecture and I spent my whole career in this university. Well, I began, I suppose, about 1970 when I was first on the staff here. And the collection grew almost by chance according to what sites I visited, what sites I took students to, what people gave me. Of course, you get bricks and pieces of corrugated iron. You don't get roof trusses and concrete slabs, so the collection reflects the smaller items you find on a building site. And it grew out of the practical process of investigating buildings. So when you investigate a building, you first, if possible, do the documentary research. You find the dates and so on, when it was built and altered, if it's been a fire, that sort of thing, because that guides you in looking at the building. Then you look at the site and see whether you think the building's been changed. You get almost an intuitive feeling for how the building grew. And finally, you go to these details. So it's more like a process of apprenticeship, not an intellectual process of learning information. And that's how these materials came together.
Right. So when you collect these samples, how do you know what to keep and what not to keep, or even what to sample at all?
Well, those items which have, say, a brand on them tend to be more important, the brand of the maker. Those that have a patent number, those that have a registration mark. Registration is similar to patents, but it's the design that's being protected, not the actual technical invention. And there are certain things that are of obvious interest. Now, one interesting part of this is that although most of this material is of local concern, the French tiles, for example, are of international interest because the same tiles were being sent from Marseille to Australia, to Argentina, to Algeria, all over the world at the same time. And the brands are the same in all these countries. Right. They came from a group of companies at Marseille in France. And nobody else in the world, as far as I know, has collected so many different brands of this type. So that is really international importance. Other items which are of local importance are those which are local inventions. There's Acryl's patent fixing brick, for example, is a local invention. So they're the prime examples. A lot of the other material becomes almost by chance which brand of brick you happen to find and you just assemble for reference purposes to compare with other bricks at other sites.
So you collected this entire collection and then eventually now it is with the university. So what made you donate it to the University of Melbourne?
Well, there's really nowhere else for it to go. There are only two really other collections in Victoria. There's a collection held by Heritage Victoria and a collection held by the National Trust. Neither is very important and they wouldn't accept a collection like this, I'm sure. So really it was an orphan.
Like you said, there are only two other collections like this. So you've sort of set a stage for these kind of building material collections. So what would you advise to the university if they were to add to this collection? How should they curate what they're getting and select from what they've been offered?
You're looking first for technical interest, second for good provenance. A brick which you don't know where it came from is of very little use to. You've got to know it came from a building and preferably the date of that building before it becomes of reference value.
While I was working with the metadata, which was quite a big task, I came across different contributors that have been a part of this collection. Do you have anything to tell us about some of them? I know there were a lot of collectors that were a part of it. So any story that you remember?
Well, apart from students who found things on site and just handed them to me, there are some people who are collection nerds. Now, there's one man, Andrew Muir, who's a real specialist in prefabricated Singapore cottages, but also in corrugated iron, and he has a collection of his own and has given me material for this collection. Another person is Chris Howe, who is a retired engineer at Warrnambool, who in the last 15 or 20 years has become a world expert on nails. Right. So although I've published some papers with him at conferences overseas, he's published much more by himself. He's been asked to speak about nails at Versailles, for example, and he mounted nail boards. That is, he got the nails, put them in order, put them in a sort of presentation format on a bit of board, and gave them to me for the collection.
We've got a couple of those, and it's amazing to see how they've got so much information on them and sort of can date which one came from when. So it's very nicely compiled.
There are quite a number of collection nerds. There are people who collect bricks, but really for no particular purpose. They collect the bricks because they want to have as many brands as they can. There are people who collect corrugated iron brands, but they don't give me the material. They have their own websites and they publish them in their own right.
Within the collectors, do you see an interest that was from people who were outside of the built environment profession as well?
Homeowners who find things in their own house are particularly interested. Sometimes you even find an inscription, say, in pencil by the carpenter. So it's not the material, it's the actual written inscription on the material.
I've heard a story that when you were going somewhere, your tiles were dropped by some airplane staff, or for some reason they're broken now. So what's the story behind that?
Well, what happened was there was a case in South Australia involving patent infringement. You have to understand that the common tile, roof tile in Australia, is the Marseille tile, which at first was made at Marseille in France and later on made in Australia. And at later times has been made in versions in concrete rather than terracotta and metal and so on. And in South Australia, a company that made metal versions of the Marseille tile sued another company for infringement of their patent. And I was called as a witness. And I brought all my French Marseille tiles with me to the case. Met a slightly hostile reception in South Australia where they didn't see why Victorians should be telling them about their tiles.
Right.
But on the way back to Melbourne, the airline dropped my box of tiles and broke them all. So some have been glued together, others are in small parts still, and I'm hoping that the digitisation will enable them to be put together digitally into one piece in each case.
Yes, that's what we're trying to do with the digital models, to put them together and see how they would have been before they broke. The Heritage Building Collection is your second collection, which is being digitized. The first one being for the Association of Preservation Technology, which was for your library. There's an increasing interest in digitizing the work that you've got. I'm sure there's always been an interest in what you've been doing, but are there any other collections that you would want to get digitized anytime in the future?
No, but the material I work on, my research material, is used by people overseas. I've just had an inquiry yesterday from somebody in England about papier-mâché houses. Now, this sort of material also needs to be made available more generally than it is at the moment.
Your research was a very big part of me figuring out the metadata for this collection as well. So it is a massive resource. And like you've told me, it started as your thesis. Is that correct?
Yes, I was doing a PhD thesis on the culture of building, essentially, on how ideas in building develop, not just scientific inventions, technical inventions, but how practices spread, how the cavity wall is used in Victoria, but not in Western Australia, for cultural reasons.
There is a growing trend of digitizing collections and having them more accessible. What do you think may be the advantage or the disadvantage to it that you see from your perspective as being in the industry for so long and actually having one-to-one, interest with the materials?
Well, the first preference is to see the materials on site and get a feel for them. The second is to see the materials in a collection like this. The third backup is to have the digital version of them. But of course, when you can have limited access to them, especially during the COVID period, the digital version is the important version to have.
Now that this collection is digitized, the kind of interest that we're expecting for it to spark is immense, especially like you said, after COVID now. What kind of initiatives or projects can take place starting from a very early age, say in high school, to doctorate kind of research?
I think one thing you can do is engage people in doing the investigation themselves. Some years ago, I cooperated with the Gippsland Historical Society, and they had a sort of competition to find corrugated iron brands in Gippsland. That involved a lot of people. It reads a lot more information, and you can do that for bricks or anything else, and school children can do that sort of thing very usefully, I think.
Right, and I guess that would sort of help them see what kind of path, if this was one of them, they'd like to take later in their life.
That, and also giving them a sort of enhanced view of the world around them.
Since this collection will now be in the public domain, how do you think a layperson can benefit from the collection?
Really, I suppose, in the same way. If you're aware of the issue of corrugated iron brands, you can then, as you drive around the countryside, stop and look at something interesting and get much more joy out of looking at old structures around the country, for example, with some knowledge behind you.
Like we just discussed, your extensive research has been a continuation of your thesis. What made you interested in the field in the first place?
I came into this area with a feeling that architecture was somewhere between science and art, and I wanted my career to be in that intervening space. I grew up in the period of Sepie, Snow, and his famous essay on the two cultures, pointing out that cultural art history and literature and so on was quite separate from science, and people who followed the one were illiterate in the other. And I wanted to be in that space in between, and that's what architecture generally is, and it's what this collection itself is.
Was it a formal decision to then, as a part of your career, start collecting items? Like, I know your library is such an extensive resource in itself, and then you've got this collection as well. So was it like a formal decision that now I'm going to start doing this, or how did it come about?
It's one of those things that happen really by chance. If you're in the field, you can't help accumulating material. That's what happened to me.
How would young researchers benefit from resources like these, or even like start having their own sort of small collection in its own way?
Well, how they benefit is really what I said before. They get an enhanced understanding of feeling for things, an idea of what to pursue. I wouldn't encourage people to develop their own collections. If we end up with thousands of personal collections, that will be chaos. It would be better for people to at least put the digitized version together with this collection and have one common resource.
So heritage is always evolving. There's always new things getting added that are of heritage significance. How have you seen the field evolve over your career?
I suppose in a way there's been more technical sophistication, been more understanding of the development of, say, reinforced concrete than there was in the past. When I began, there was the National Trust, and people classified buildings because they were gracious or classically fine, or because the Lord Mayor was born in one. Now there's a much broader understanding of what makes an important structure.
Right. And how do you think it would evolve from now on, now that we've got all these digital technologies that help us conserve it, not physically, but also digitally?
Well, I don't say that digital technologies is changing it so much as enabling it. What has happened since I began my career was the Borough Charter, which now makes you work out the significance of a place, why you preserve it. And now we have the Borough Charter, we can use this material, these resources, to clarify the significance, technical and otherwise, of a structure.
Right. Thank you so much for being here with us today and for taking out the time to talk to us.
Thank you.